Here is a question worth sitting with for a moment. Two people walk into a clinic. Same age, same weight, same waist measurement. One of them has a metabolic profile that looks fine. The other is at significantly elevated risk for type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and metabolic syndrome. The only meaningful difference between them? Where their fat is stored. That distinction between fat you can see and fat you can't is what this video is about. Your body holds fat in two fundamentally different compartments. Subcutaneous fat sits just under your skin. You can pinch it. It's the soft layer on your belly, hips, and thighs. Visceral fat is something else entirely. It lives deep inside your abdominal cavity, wrapped around your liver, pancreas, and intestines. You cannot feel it from the outside, and a flat-looking stomach offers no guarantee you don't have a significant amount of it. Research published in the journal Obesity has consistently shown that visceral fat is an independent predictor of cardiometabolic disease, meaning the risk it carries doesn't disappear even when your overall weight looks normal. That's the part that tends to surprise people most. Your scale has been measuring the wrong thing. If you're over 40, have noticed stubborn belly fat that doesn't respond the way the rest of your body does, or you've hit a wall with fat loss even while doing the right things, visceral fat is likely the variable no one has properly explained to you. That changes today. Think of subcutaneous fat like insulation. It's passive storage, cushioning, thermal regulation, a reserve energy supply. It takes up space, and you'd prefer less of it, but it doesn't actively harm you the way its deeper counterpart does. Metabolically speaking, subcutaneous fat is relatively quiet. Visceral fat operates on a completely different logic. Because of its anatomical position, directly adjacent to your organs and draining into your liver via the portal vein, everything visceral fat releases hits your liver first, and visceral fat releases a lot. Here's where it gets important. Research published in the Journal of the American College of Cardiology identified a specific phenotype now referred to as metabolically obese, normal weight. People with healthy BMI scores who carry elevated visceral fat. Their cardiovascular risk profile was comparable to individuals with clinical obesity. Normal weight, high risk. The BMI told the wrong story entirely. So the question isn't just how much fat you're carrying, it's where it lives. Most people think of fat as storage tissue. Inert, passive, just sitting there waiting to be burned. Visceral fat doesn't behave that way. It functions more like an endocrine organ, continuously secreting chemical messengers that circulate through your body and alter how your organs function. The primary signals visceral fat sends are inflammatory. It releases elevated concentrations of cytokines, specifically interleukin-6 and tumor necrosis factor alpha, at rates significantly higher than subcutaneous fat, even when total fat mass is similar. Research documented in Cell Metabolism has confirmed this difference in secretion profiles between the two fat depots. Picture your abdominal organs sitting in a low-grade inflammatory environment, not acutely, not dramatically, but persistently, day after day, year after year. That chronic signal doesn't produce obvious symptoms in the short term. What it does over time is progressively erode insulin sensitivity, disrupt your liver's glucose regulation, raise cardiovascular risk markers, and accelerate cellular aging. The liver takes the most direct hit. Visceral fat's portal vein connection means free fatty acids and inflammatory compounds flood the liver continuously. This is a primary driver behind non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, which research published in Hepatology estimates now affects roughly 1 in 4 adults globally, and which can progress silently for years before showing up in standard blood work. Visceral fat also suppresses adiponectin, one of the few genuinely anti-inflammatory signals that adipose tissue produces. Adiponectin protects insulin sensitivity and dampens systemic inflammation. The more visceral fat you accumulate, the less adiponectin you have. It's a compounding problem. The fat that inflames you simultaneously removes one of your body's key defenses against inflammation. Visceral fat accumulation isn't random. It's your body responding rationally to a set of signals. The problem is that those signals were designed for a different environment. Visceral fat is positioned close to your liver for a reason. It's rapid access energy storage, designed for moments of acute physical threat or starvation. When your body needs energy fast, visceral depots can be mobilized quickly. That was useful when the stressor was a sprint for survival. It is considerably less useful when the stressor is a deadline, a difficult conversation, or a night of poor sleep. The hormone at the center of this is cortisol. Research published in Psychosomatic Medicine found a consistent pattern. Individuals with greater abdominal fat accumulation showed larger cortisol responses to psychological stress. The biology here is direct. Cortisol signals the body to store energy centrally, close to the organs that need it during threat response. Chronic low-grade stress keeps that signal running in the background continuously. Several factors specifically accelerate visceral fat accumulation. Declining estrogen and testosterone after 40 shift fat distribution toward the abdomen. This has been documented prospectively in both men and women. Chronic sleep disruption raises cortisol while simultaneously suppressing growth hormone, a combination that promotes central fat storage. And insulin resistance creates a hormonal environment where fat breakdown is suppressed and fat storage is amplified, particularly in visceral depots. None of this means your body is working against you. It means your body is responding to the signals you're giving it. Stress, sleep deprivation, hormonal shifts, with the exact mechanisms evolution built. The challenge is that modern life runs those mechanisms chronically. If visceral fat is invisible and BMI can't capture it reliably, how do you assess it practically? The gold standard is DEXA, or MRI imaging. Both can directly quantify visceral fat volume. For most people, those aren't accessible without a clinical referral. But research validates several practical proxies that you can measure yourself. Waist circumference, measured at the natural waist, midpoint between your lower rib and hip bone, is the most widely used. A consensus statement published in Diabetes Care confirmed that waist circumference outperforms BMI as a proxy for visceral fat-related metabolic risk. Evidence-based thresholds, acknowledging meaningful variation by ethnicity, suggest elevated risk above roughly 102 centimeters, 40 inches for men, and 88 centimeters, 35 inches for women. For South and East Asian populations, research supports lower thresholds. Waist-to-height ratio is arguably more sensitive because it adjusts for body size. Divide your waist circumference by your height in the same units. Published data consistently associates a ratio above 0.5 with significantly elevated cardiometabolic risk, and some research suggests this single number outperforms both BMI and waist circumference alone as a metabolic risk proxy. These are estimates, not diagnoses, but knowing your numbers gives you a meaningful signal, one that your standard annual physical is unlikely to flag. Let's be direct about something. No supplement, no single food, and no specific exercise targets visceral fat in isolation. Spot reduction is not how human physiology works. What research does show consistently is that visceral fat is preferentially mobilized during a sustained caloric deficit, meaning it is often among the first reserves your body accesses when it needs to break down stored fat. A meta-analysis published in the International Journal of Obesity confirmed that visceral fat is reduced proportionally more than subcutaneous fat during calorie-restricted weight loss. Even modest overall fat loss can produce meaningful visceral fat reduction, which matters for metabolic risk reduction, faster than the scale might suggest. Exercise has a particularly well-documented independent effect. A systematic review published in Obesity Reviews found that aerobic exercise reduced visceral fat even in trials where participants lost minimal total body weight. The proposed mechanisms go beyond simple calorie expenditure. Improved insulin sensitivity, reduced cortisol reactivity, and enhanced mitochondrial function in abdominal adipose tissue all appear to contribute. Resistance training adds another layer. Research in obesity found that resistance training alone reduced visceral fat over time, and that combining aerobic and resistance work produced additive benefits specifically for visceral fat reduction, not just general body composition. Dietary quality matters beyond calorie totals. Research published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition found that diets higher in refined carbohydrates and ultra-processed foods were associated with greater visceral fat accumulation even at similar calorie intakes, likely through insulin dynamics and gut microbiome disruption. Sleep, often absent from fat loss conversations, has direct relevance here. A prospective study published in Sleep found that short sleep duration was independently associated with visceral fat accumulation over 5 years, separate from diet and exercise habits. The mechanism involves cortisol elevation and suppressed growth hormone release, both of which directly influence central fat storage.
There's a self-reinforcing mechanism that most fat loss approaches completely overlook, and it's worth understanding because it explains why some people do everything right and still struggle with abdominal fat. Visceral fat contains an enzyme, 11-beta-HSD1, that converts inactive cortisol precursors into active cortisol locally within the fat tissue itself. This means visceral fat doesn't just accumulate in a high cortisol environment, it actively maintains that environment. Research published in Science demonstrated this mechanism in detail. Local cortisol amplification within visceral adipose tissue worsens insulin resistance and sustains the hormonal conditions that favor continued visceral fat storage. Stress causes visceral fat. Visceral fat produces cortisol locally. That cortisol promotes more visceral fat storage, round and round. Breaking this loop requires treating stress management as a metabolic intervention, not a lifestyle suggestion. Evidence supports mindfulness-based stress reduction, structured sleep, and progressive exercise as interventions with documented effects on cortisol reactivity and, by extension, visceral fat specifically. These aren't secondary priorities. For some people, they're the primary lever.
Here's what this comes down to. Your scale measures mass. Your BMI divides that mass by height squared. Neither one tells you whether the fat you're carrying is sitting quietly under your skin or wrapped around your organs, running a continuous inflammatory signal to your liver, your blood vessels, and your immune system. Visceral fat is the type that does the biological damage. It suppresses your protective hormones, inflames your organs, disrupts your liver, and maintains the very cortisol environment that caused it to accumulate in the first place. And it does all of that silently, with no symptoms you'd notice in the short term. The research also shows something important on the other side of this. Visceral fat responds. It's preferentially mobilized in a caloric deficit. It shrinks with consistent aerobic and resistance training, sometimes before your total weight changes significantly. It improves with better sleep and lower cortisol load. You are not stuck with it. What the science makes clear is that this is a solvable problem, not overnight, not with any single intervention, but systematically, by working with the biology rather than against it. Addressing your caloric balance, your exercise mix, your sleep, and your cortisol load aren't separate issues. They are all inputs into the same system. And visceral fat is one of the most responsive tissues in the body when those inputs shift in the right direction. If this gave you a clearer picture of what's actually happening inside your body, like and subscribe for more content built on the published evidence, not the hype. Leave a comment. Did you know visceral and subcutaneous fat were biologically this different? I'd genuinely like to know where you were starting from. And if you know someone who keeps doing everything right and still can't shift the belly, send them this. Understanding the mechanism is often the missing piece.